When you first start playing Marvel Champions, the idea of deck building can be overwhelming for a lot of people, and it can be hard to start deck building. So this video is going to help you get started on deck building so that you can continue deck building and access that portion of the game, because there's a whole extra realm of fun and possibilities that open up when you start deck building for this game. So I want to make sure that everyone has access to start doing that. So here's what I'll be talking about in this video so you can get an overview. First thing I'm going to address is why should you deck build? And then I'll talk about barriers to entry and how to fix those. We'll talk about understanding hero identity, where you actually should start in your deck building process, player counts, because deck building is a little different at 1, 2, 3, and 4 players. Then we'll talk about understanding the aspects, talk about pairing aspects in 2-player, talk about villains, and then finally keywords. And after going over all of this, you should have a really good foundation for actually starting to deck build in this game. So why should you deck build? And these are kind of the main reasons. This isn't an exhaustive list. There's more than just this. But I think that these are really important. Not only are there multiple aspects, it actually is an entirely new aspect of the game. So certain heroes, when they come with the Precon deck, might not even be that functional. And heroes function very differently in each of the different aspects, as well as are very different in power. So you can have a hero that is really horrible to play with the Precon deck, and then you adjust their deck and suddenly they become very good. And that could actually change heroes from being heroes you don't like to some of your favorite heroes in the game. It also lets you craft your own experience with playing. So you can choose the style that you want to play. You don't have to just play the Precon deck or play a set list. You can play your own game and set up your own scenarios to create either like thematic things. Like you could have all shield or all Avengers, or you could do an event heavy deck. You could play high tempo, you could play building, you could play slow, you could play rush, you could do all these different things, and deck building allows you to actually access that and express yourself and create your own experience in the game. And also, with many of the final bosses, it's going to be pretty necessary to adjust decks and build powerful decks to win, especially if you want to play an expert or heroic. It's certain villains I'm not sure even possible to defeat with a Precon deck. Especially depending on the Precon deck that you get. So it'll open up the avenue to actually face all of the villains and have a better chance at winning. And I mentioned this already, but the Precon decks are not very good. It's really rare to have a functional Precon deck. So as soon as you start editing your decks, you'll notice a huge bump in power and fun. And yeah, you can unlock a character's potential, and it's seriously just a lot of fun to deck build. It's one of my favorite things about this game. And again, this is not the only reasons to deck build, but you really should consider deck building for this game, because the living card game is for the purpose of actually deck building and creating different experiences while you're playing. So these are just a few different things that I've seen people say that prevent them from actually deck building. One of them is just not knowing where to start, which can be rough. It can be kind of overwhelming for some people to even figure it out. There's like 4 different aspects, 5 if you count pool, 6 if you count basic, and there's so many different heroes, so many different cards, that it can be hard to actually start and figure out an idea that works. Also, the card pool, I've heard people say that there's not like they don't have enough cards to build decks for what they want, or also analysis paralysis, where you have too many cards and you don't know where to start because you just have way too many options. And then another thing is that they don't want to lose. Like they're worried that if you start deck building, you'll start losing because your decks aren't good. But yeah, that shouldn't stop you. And then it can be inconvenient with the organization, because like if you want to build decks and then use the same cards in other people's decks, you'll have to be able to efficiently like deconstruct your decks, store the cards in order, find the cards. So you'll have to get a whole organization system set up. And then net decking, some people just only net deck, or they're like kind of compare themselves to decks they see online, and like, if I can't build a deck that's that good, what's the point? And then yeah, that's not, there's probably other reasons as well, but it's definitely, you should not let any of this stop you from deck building. So just instead of thinking about these things that can hold you back, you should just start where you're at with deck building And you don't need a full card pool. The core box is more than you need. The core box has a lot of options for you to start deck building just on its own. You can also limit, if you're dealing with analysis paralysis, you can limit your options. So you could just use the hero pack plus the core box, or you could do like one wave, or you could limit yourself to Avengers to, sort of shrink that card pool so that you can actually find a place to start without it being overwhelming. And then for the inconvenience of it, I think you should organize the aspects by types. So the way I do it is I have each aspect split up, and then I have inside the aspects them organized by all the upgrades are together, all the supports are together, all the events and allies are together. So then I can easily just flip through. So if I know I'm looking for an aggression event, I can just flip through the aggression events and find it. And then for the net decking, this is maybe more of a controversial one, but I don't think that you should net deck if you're trying to improve on your own deck building skills, which you can utilize online decks to help you. But if you're just copying the decks directly and you don't try to come up with your own ideas, or it'll kind of stand in your way and kind of stop you from learning, because like part of the process is making decks that don't work, figuring out why, and then updating to make a deck that does work. And you'll learn a lot from that process that you wouldn't necessarily learn if you were just looking online at deck lists that are already there to actually help you start. And you should, again, I want to emphasize here, just start wherever you're at. It doesn't matter if you have deck building experience already from other games, or if you're brand new, just start deck building. That ultimately it does come down to this. Just start. And I'm going to go into a bunch of helpful tips now that'll help you. First thing is going to be understanding the hero's identity, because ultimately when you're building a deck, you're building it for a hero. And that hero is going to have their own set of strengths and weaknesses that are a result of their cards. So you want to start by understanding that and figuring out what it is you actually want to do. So let's go over some examples. Peter Parker, he has strengths and weaknesses. So his strengths are that he has really high economy, he has high survivability, he has good burst damage with his swing web kick, and he can cancel treachery, so he has a bit of control. But he has this weakness of having inconsistent thwarting. So that's something you want to think about. So in multiplayer, you see I have the multiplayer and solo on the left here. Multiplayer, generally, I think it's a better idea to try to lean into the strengths that your character has. And in solo, since you're on your own, you probably want to try to patch up the weaknesses that you have. So if you're thinking about playing Spider-Man and you're playing in solo, you probably want to build some thwarting into your deck so that you can mitigate that weakness he has. But if you're playing in multiplayer, you might want to lean into the high survivability, play protection build where you block for everyone, or you could use his damage and economy to play a bunch of attack events or something like that. So you want to figure out what you're doing there. So some other examples from the core box are Captain Marvel. Her strengths are going to be that she has really high economy, because she just draws so many cards. And her energy channel lets her have a really strong final push, because you can stack up those energy counters, you can store 10 damage, and then you can unleash all of that at once, meaning you can just one-shot a villain pretty easily with her. Her weakness is like not that extreme, it's just that some of her cards just aren't that good. Like her thwart event is, it's okay, it's not good. It's not really as good as aspect cards that have came out recently. And like some of her cards, like if you don't lean into her like cosmic flight, your like helmet isn't as good and stuff like that. So her cards on their own really aren't that great. It's just she draws so many cards that you can play more cards per turn than the average hero, and that's what makes her strong. So for her, she doesn't have so many weaknesses to deal with, so she's going to be a little more versatile in what you can do with her, especially since she has high economy. And She-Hulk, her strengths that she has high health, she has high attack, and she has a lot of readies. So in multiplayer, you might want to put her into more of a minion slayer role, or just where you just buff up her attack stat. You go down to alter ego and you flip up to get your damage from her do you even lift ability. And you can just be the primary damage dealer, and you don't have to worry about having control or having a bunch of allies or doing a bunch of threat removal for the team. But in solo, this is going to be rough. Your 4 hand size really limits you with her because you can't afford as many cards when you have 4 hand size, which naturally makes it a lot weaker than another hero would be. And she doesn't have very good thwart. The only way she really gets thwarting is by going to alter ego. So with her, you want to try to build in economy or build in something that can give her a bunch of thwart, or you want to try to rush the villain down and just try to end the game very quickly. So that's kind of an interesting example with characters in solo. If they have good damage, you can try to just rush the villain down. But if you don't want to do that rush strategy, you'll want to try to patch your weaknesses, which for her, you're going to want to try to build in some economy, and you're going to want to try to build in some thwarting. And for Iron Man, his strengths are that he essentially has a win condition of getting to his final form. Once you have all of his suit out and you have all of his upgrades, you kind of just win the game. So it's more so about getting there. He has really high economy as well with his alter ego ability, letting him, look at the top 3 cards of his deck and add one to his hand. So that's his thing. He has high economy, and he has a win condition of getting his suit together and then overtaking the game. His weaknesses are pretty big, though. So for him, he has a 1 hand size at the beginning of the game, which is absolutely brutal. It's really rough and really hard to play around. And since you have to build your suit to increase your hand size, he can be really slow tempo. So he's much more difficult to play than a lot of the other heroes. So if you're just starting out, he's going to be difficult because you'll have to figure out a way to not lose to the main scheme. In solo specifically, you'll have to figure out a way to not lose to the main scheme while staying in alter ego, which can be really difficult. So that is going to require a lot of thinking on your part. And then for the strengths in multiplayer, you can just kind of sit in alter ego and just speed run your suit. So you might want to, you don't have to worry about building in so many of the, protections that you might need in solo for him. So this is kind of a framework for understanding your hero identity. So whenever you are thinking about a hero, you want to think, what are my hero's strengths? What are their weaknesses? And then think about what mode you're playing. Are you playing in solo? And then you want to come up, or multiplayer. So if you're playing in solo, you'll want to come up with a strategy to either fix some of your weaknesses or end the game as fast as you can. And then in multiplayer, you might want to specialize. You might want to lean into your strengths. You can still do a generalist deck, but you just have the option now of being a specialist instead of a generalist. And you can lean into those strengths and really build around your hero's identity in a way that solo kind of limits you. Okay, now, where should you start? Because that's naturally the question that you want to ask. And I think that the best place to start is actually going to be with the precons that come in the core box. So you'll see in the Learn to Play book, there'll be this section where it lists out a bunch of starter decks for each of them. And it gives a Black Panther protection list, an Iron Man aggression list, a Captain Marvel in leadership, Spider-Man in justice, and She-Hulk in aggression. So what you can do is you can just kind of put these decks together, because the aggression cards and the basic cards, there's enough to where you can have all 4 of these decks put together at the same time. And then if you're playing, let's say, Spider-Man, you can just throw the aggression card deck onto him to try him in aggression, or throw the protection deck onto him to try him in protection. So that way you can experiment with the aspects a little bit. So you can pick a hero that you like, that you're comfortable with, that you want to learn how to play, and then play them in the different aspects so you can learn how it feels in those aspects. And you'll notice that, not all the cards are as good as all of the other cards. You'll see that you'll be playing some of the cards more so than the others. And if you keep track of that, what you can do is you can just, if you notice you're not playing a card, like let's say you're not playing Emergency as much. You notice you didn't use it in the game that you played. And let's say you are using let's say Relentless Assault. You did use Relentless Assault, but you weren't using Emergency. Then maybe what you could do is add another copy of Relentless Assault and take out that copy of Emergency. And that can improve your deck. And then through an iterative process like that, you'll naturally end up with modified versions of these precons that are your own deck. And they're your own deck lists, and you'll experience what it's like to actually deck build from there. So you won't have to start from scratch like that. You'll have a framework to start with, but by doing this, you can really experiment, learn how each of the aspects feels, and then practice that iterative process of noticing things that don't work and then fixing them. I highly recommend this. And if you go onto my channel, you'll see the progression series where I play with all these core box precons all the way through the core box. And I was able to defeat all of the scenarios on expert and solo with these different precon decks. So just playing, you'll get better, and you'll be able to like make use of these decks, but you will notice a significant difference in the strength of them as you edit them slightly. So now let's talk about player counts, because the player count that you're in is going to inform a lot of your decision making through this process. So in solo, the main scheme can cause you to randomly lose, which is really, really rough. Like you'll notice if you play against Rhino, you go to Alter Ego one time, he'll scheme, and then if you get an advance, you just lose the game. And it feels really unfair, and it's just rough. Like solo, you can lose the main scheme very easily. And it's also prone to more bad luck because of that. Like you can just get a really nasty stream of encounter cards that just really shut down what you were trying to do. But also you can get lucky in solo because you're not going through the deck multiple times like you would in multiplayer. Sometimes you'll be able to actually avoid the villain's strong cards. So there's good luck and bad luck in solo. And then it's going to often require that you do a generalist deck or a rush strategy. Because since you're by yourself, you'll have to deal with everything as it comes out, or you just rush the villain. So you want to figure out what you're doing before you build your deck. You'll want to know if you're building a generalist deck or if you're building a rush strategy. And kind of tying into the main scheme causing you to lose, you also don't have as much access to Alter Ego. So characters that have good Alter Ego abilities won't have as much access to that Alter Ego ability as they would in multiplayer. Another thing that you don't have access to your recovery as often as you would either. So survivability gets a little bit more difficult as well. And then another thing is that good solo decks are not always good in other player counts. So if you're building a deck in solo that's just focused on, let's say you use emergency to, flip to Alter Ego and then stop it from the main scheme from finishing, that might work in solo, but it's not going to be as impactful when you go into multiplayer because there'll be more things to deal with. So having things so the parts of the game that get shut down when you're in solo, like your Alter Ego access, for instance, in multiplayer, you might want to lean into that and find a different build that can take advantage of that strength better. So in 2-player, it's a little less random. You won't just lose to one stream of encounter cards as often as you will in solo. And that does allow you to specialize, because if you're playing with 2 players, for instance, one person can deal with the damage and the other person can do the threat removal. So you can specialize into those roles if you want to. And then it'll be easier to access Alter Ego because you're not as afraid of the main scheme finishing. And then you can think about aspect combos now. We're going to go over that later about aspect pairing. But it is important to think about what aspects that you're pairing together, because that will change the builds that you have available to you in those different aspects. And I do think that 2-player is probably the most balanced game mode. It's the most balanced player count in my experience. So, and because of that balance, I think it's also the best to test your deck builds in, and it's also my favorite player count. So 3-player, fair villains will basically never cause you to lose randomly. It's going to be really rare that villains will just make you lose to where there's nothing anyone could have done to stop it. And once you get to 3 and 4-player, it does encourage specializing in a way that 1 and 2-player don't, because with having 3 players, suddenly you can now cover a specialist in damage, a specialist in threat removal, and a specialist in defense. All 3 parts of the game there, you can have one person trying to take care of that. You can play like 3 generalist decks, but you can specialize now, and it's better at 3-player than it is at 2 and 1-player to have those specialists. And then any aspect combo can work here, whereas not really any aspect combo can work as well in 2-player. And then I think when thinking about the villains overall, there's a pretty even distribution of scenarios that are really easy in 3-player, scenarios that feel balanced, and some that, scale to where it ends up being more difficult in multiplayer than it is at the lower player counts. And then having one person in alter ego at all times is probably a good idea, because you can cycle who's getting access to the alter ego stuff here. So if you think about Iron Man in 3-player, he'll want to be an alter ego a bunch, which can help him out. Whereas in 2-player, he still might not be able to sit there in alter ego the whole time. And 4-player, things can get a little crazy. The game gets really, really long, and you can get these really weird strings of encounter cards. And also because of how much is going on and how the decks interact together, there's a lot of really broken things that the 4 players can do on their side, and there's also a lot of really weird things that can happen when the villain starts doing surge train. So this can get a little unruly. And sometimes it can be too easy. So like some villains in particular don't scale with player count very well. So like Claw, for instance, only gives out 1 minion at the beginning. So the more players you add, the easier that gets. And in 4-player, Claw just doesn't really do much, is how it feels. Whereas in solo, Claw can be really difficult. And specialized roles are more necessary here in 4-player. They're still not completely necessary, but you are going to want big bursts of things. You'll want someone that can do a lot of damage. You'll want someone that can do a lot of threat removal. And that may be, that might mean that you need to use specialized roles, or just have really broken decks that are just generalists that, scale up. But yeah, specialized roles in 4-player, I think, are the best place to use them. And I do think it's less balanced than 2 to 3-player because of how kind of crazy it all gets. And I do think that in 4-player especially, it's probably just correct that one person is an alter ego every turn. In 3-player, it's not necessarily a good idea, because sometimes it can still get a little rough on the threat. But in 4-player, you should pretty much always have one person in alter ego, making use of their alter ego ability. And I like 4-player on occasion, but it is a bit longer than my preference is. So I have to be in the mood for 4-player. Now let's go on a deep dive into each of the aspects and really understand what these aspects are about, because they do function very, very differently from one another. So let's start with aggression. So for each of these aspects, I'm going to have the power of card, which is the resource card that is a double for cards of that same color. And then some cards that from the core box and really early sets that I think really show what this aspect is about. So for aggression, combat training increases your attack. So increasing your attack stat of your hero is a big part of aggression. Relentless Assault is a really good way of taking out minions, and it can grant overkill. And then when you take out those minions, you can use Chase Them Down to remove 2 threat from a scheme. So aggression, especially in multiplayer, is a lot about minion slaying. And then Uppercut is just deal 5 damage to an enemy. And these kind of attack events with burst damage will help you to just take out minions in one shot and help you to take out the villain when you go for that final push. So in solo, you're going to kind of break it up into 2 aspects here. You're probably going to play aggression if you're trying to rush and just defeat the villain as fast as you can. Or if you want to get minion slaying, so like Relentless Assault type cards into your deck to pair with a hero that's already good at thwarting but is maybe lacking damage. And in multiplayer, I think aggression really comes down to a minion slaying role, because hitting the villain for like 5 damage when they have like 100 health just doesn't really do anything. It doesn't help the board state. Like, it doesn't make it more likely for you guys to win, if that makes sense, because you're not really getting any closer to actually being able to take out the villain, and then you're not, playing allies or playing upgrades or supports that can improve and help you stay alive and build up your economy and things like that. So for multiplayer, I think this is mostly with an asterisk, because there are other things that you can do, but it's mostly to take out minions. And then for Justice, it has the analogous Heroic Intuition, where you can buff up your thwart. Jessica Jones is one of my favorite allies. She's from the core box, where she gets +1 thwart for each side scheme in play, which in certain scenarios, there's a lot of side schemes. And then player side schemes also count for this. So if you're doing player side schemes, you might want to include Jessica Jones as well, because she gets those big stats. And then, so it's going to be about buffing up your thwart stat, defeating side schemes, and then using cards like For Justice to keep the main scheme in check, and also keep control of those side schemes. And Overwatch is kind of a multiplayer card, where when any amount of threat is removed from the attached scheme by a thwart, you discard it to remove an equal amount of threat from a different scheme. And that's so that you can help keep the main scheme and the side schemes in check. So in solo, you're going to want to use Justice to defeat side schemes and to like buy you time so that you can get your heroes upgrades and supports out. So a good example of that is Iron Man. Iron Man is great to pair into Justice, especially with a smaller card pool where you might not have access to all those like protection tech cards, so that you can, stall essentially, so you can actually get your suit made. And then it also gives you access to Alter Ego. So if you can get the main scheme down to 0 when you're playing in solo, that means you can actually flip down, which means you can heal and get your Alter Ego access, which means that in solo, it's actually really good at survivability. This also is good in survivability in 2, 3, and 4 player as well, by keeping the main scheme in check, but it's most impactful here in solo. And it really just helps you control. So the way I look at Justice in solo is that I'm really trying to just stall and then focus on building up my hero's kit and building up my economy so that I can just win through that. Like my win condition is my hero, and I use Justice to make sure I can consistently get to my end state. And then in multiplayer, there's a lot of threat. Threat scales the hardest in multiplayer out of all the different things you're going to be dealing with. So it's going to be really key to have a Justice player around so that you can deal with these side schemes that add threat per player. So yeah. And then player side schemes, if you have like a more complete card pool, Justice gets even better with being able to finish those even easier. So now leadership, have allies here, because allies, as you may have heard, are the strongest card type in the game. I totally agree with that sentiment. They're just kind of ridiculous, because if you think about it, allies, they remove threat, they deal damage, and they block and keep you alive. So one card type solves all 3 of the problems that you're dealing with in the game, which is just kind of crazy to me. So then lead from the front is a card that lets you choose a player, and each character gets +1 thwart and +1 attack till the end of the phase. So you can get a swarm of allies out, buff up all their stats, and you can also choose a player, so it doesn't necessarily have to be you. So you can also support the table. So if you're playing with like Quicksilver or something, you could use cards like Lead from the Front to buff up Quicksilver's stats and like help him with the ready. And then Maria Hill, when she enters play, each player draws 1 card. So you can see that theme of the leadership player being kind of a support for the table in multiplayer. And Make the Call lets you pay the printed cost of an ally in any player's discard pile and put it into play under your control. So you can go into other players' discard piles and grab like aggression allies or justice allies if you want them, or just recycle really good allies like Maria Hill and Nick Fury and stuff like that. And the Triskelion increases your ally limit by 1. So when you're playing leadership, it really is just kind of, you are playing allies and you're supporting yourself and your teammates to victory. And I think that leadership is the easiest way to play solo, because those allies solve all your problems for you. And then you can just build up your board and then burst the villain down with all your allies and your hero cards. And it offers you a lot of control because of that as well. So in multiplayer, again, you want to be playing allies, and kind of it breaks into like Swarm and Voltron. So in Swarm, you can just get a bunch of them onto the table at once, which can block for everyone and like ready them up, do big burst damage, that type of thing. Or you can also Voltron them, which means that you take one ally and you put a bunch of upgrades on them. And you can make that one ally extremely powerful, and they can be basically a second hero at the table. And then another thing about multiplayer, you can lean more into that support role where you're boosting up your other players instead of just spamming allies onto the table. And because allies are solving threat, damage, and health, that allows you, that just kind of inherently makes you a generalist. So it allows you to fill in for the weaknesses that other players' decks may have. So you can make up for like the aggression players' thwarting problems, or make up for the justice players' damage problems, that type of thing. And then because of that, it also pairs well with every other aspect. So you can play leadership along with any other aspect, and it'll be a totally fine pairing. Now on to the last aspect, which is going to be protection. And protection is mostly about blocking damage and healing damage. So you can see Armored Vest. It increases your hero's defense stat, which leans into those archetypes where you're trying to use your defense stat and then block all the damage and ready, that type of thing. Med Team is probably one of my favorite cards in the whole game. It lets you exhaust it to remove a medical counter and then heal 2 damage from a friendly character. So that can be a friendly identity, or it can be an ally, so you can get extra activations out of your allies. It's a great card. I really, really like Med Team. And then Indomitable, after your hero defends, you discard it and then ready your hero. So protection, for meta reasons that we don't have to go into in this video, sort of became the readying aspect. So early on in the card pool, it was the defense and healing aspect, and then it kind of became just ready over and over again. So that's kind of how it splits up into defend, heal, and ready. And in solo, you want to choose heroes that have a specific reason to be in protection, because protection is, I think, the hardest aspect to make work in solo, because it's not helping you. I got to preface this with the identity that it originally was. It doesn't help you with threat, really. It doesn't help you with damage, really. It just keeps you alive. But the problem with that is if you're just staying alive, you're not actually getting closer to winning. So it kind of is weak in solo for that reason. And then there are archetypes though that are really good. So the repurpose archetype is where you use tech, which increase your stats, and you get a bunch of readies. So you can like repurpose your tech upgrades. You get like +2 thwart or something like that, and then you can ready and do a bunch of threat removal that way. Ever Vigilant is aerial, which also lets you ready and thwart, which that is a pretty good thing. So if you want to do the more specific builds, you can try to find a tech build or like an aerial build in there. And my favorite way to play protection is actually when I just want to focus on a hero's kit. So if a hero is really good at damage and really good at threat removal already, then sometimes I like to just pair them into protection so that I can just make sure I stay alive so that I can get to that. So heroes that have really strong hero kits and identity specific cards, you might want to put into protection. So some examples of that are Domino, Gambit, Iceman, and Iron Man. It's like Domino, once she gets her pistols rolling and she has, you know, all of her upgrades out, she kind of just dominates the game. Same thing with Iron Man, where they can just kind of win. And Iron Man has that specific tech synergy that you want to pair him into, which is really good. And then Iceman has really cool stuff with his Frostbite, and that gives you a reason to play protection and use your defense because you have that extra bonus. A newer hero is Nightcrawler that does that. And Gambit has 3 defense, and he has really good damage in his kit already. So you can use protection to like keep him alive, block for some people, and then deal a bunch of damage. So then in multiplayer, I think protection gets a lot better because you can start blocking for the whole table by increasing your defense stat and readying, and that gives a lot of freedom to the other players to like really not worry about staying alive and just worry about, you know, dealing damage and removing threat. And you can heal up the team with things like Med Team and Night Nurse to keep people's allies alive and keep their identities alive. And you can get chip damage. So when you do things like Retaliate and Jump Flip and things like that, you can actually, you know, get a little damage or get a little threat removal just for defending. So you can further the board state there so that you kind of just chip away at damage and you chip away at threat removal while also defending. So it's kind of like, you know, just a 2-for-1 where I get to block for you and also do something else. And then the more players you add, the better I think protection is, because it doesn't really further your damage or your threat removal as much as like aggression or justice or leadership would, but it helps the other players. It's really good in the support role of just keeping everyone alive. So I think protection is best in 4-player. And now that we've talked about each of them on their own, we can talk about how they pair together. So here's an example of how I think about pairing the aspects to the heroes from the core box. So She-Hulk, I think, is good to go in aggression. In solo, you can use it to rush the villain down. And then in multiplayer, you could use it to just be the minion killer for the team, so that you can, deal with all those minions and other players can deal with the threat. And then for protection, Iron Man, if you have the tech cards, I think goes well into protection. So that's an example of a hero that has a specific reason to play cards in protection, that being tech. Then you would put him in protection. And then Captain Marvel is a generalist with a high economy, so I think leadership naturally works really well for her. And then Spider-Man, I think, goes really well with Justice because he has problems thwarting, and that's his only real problem that he has. So then Justice can fix that problem for him. And then in multiplayer, you want to actually think about how you pair them together. So in 3 and 4 player, any pairing works. So like if you're doing aggression, protection, power, leadership, that works. Protection, leadership, justice, that works. Literally any combo of 3 aspects works in 3 and 4 player. So I'm going to focus on 2 player pairings, and I created a little system here for you to think about. So I assigned just numbers to them. So I gave aggression 3 points in damage because it's good at dealing damage. I gave it 1 point in thwarting because it's not very good at threat removal. And I gave it 2 in defense because taking out the minions actually keeps you alive. So then I gave each of them that. So protection, it doesn't have very much damage, so it's at 1 in damage. Doesn't have very much thwart, it's at 1 in thwart. But it does have really good defense, so it gets 3 there. Leadership is just really solid. It has good damage, it has a good thwarting, and it has really good defense because allies can just block for you. So leadership gets a 2-2-3, which is very good. And Justice lacks a bit of damage, is really good at thwarting, and has okay defense in the sense that you can flip down to Alter Ego and heal, whereas Aggression isn't as good at that. So then to pair these, you can think about it as just, combining 2 aspects and then making sure that you have at least 3 points in every category if you want a balanced game. So if you have less than 3 total points, that would be a weakness. And if it's greater than 3, it would be a strength. So if we take an example, let's pair aggression and justice together. In damage, we have 3 points from aggression and 1 from justice, giving us 4 points. So that means that our damage would be a strength. We have 1 point in thwarting from aggression and 3 from justice. So that would be 4 points, and that would be a strength. And then in defense, we have 2 points and 2 points from each of them, meaning we get 4. So we get a 4-4-4, meaning we're great at everything, and you should have it's a really good pairing. And then if we look at something that's not quite as strong, so in my opinion, protection and justice wouldn't pair together as well, we'd have 2 points in damage, meaning that'd be a weakness. We'd have 4 in thwarting, so that would be a strength, and we'd have 5 in defense, so that would be a very big strength. But in that game, you'd be missing out on damage. You'd feel that weakness of not having as much damage. You might get overwhelmed by minions. And then you'll notice leadership, because it's good at everything, can actually pair with any aspect here and be totally fine. So if you pair leadership with protection, you'd get 3 damage, 3 thwart, and 6 defense, which is crazy. And I think that's accurate of like your defense. If you pair these together, it's going to be really hard to lose to damage. And you'll have just enough thwart and just enough damage to get through. So yeah, if you want to think about it this way, hopefully that's helpful. I like thinking about it this way. So then any aspect combo you want to think of, you can just, look at this little chart and then figure out what weaknesses you might have and what strengths you might have. So now this is something kind of an aside that I wanted to talk about, which is related to testing. And I wanted to just point out that I think that Claw is not actually a good test villain. And you might see that people are saying he is a good test villain, which has its reasons. Is because he has a lot of side schemes, he has a lot of minions, and he has a pretty good amount of health, so he pressures you on each of those fronts. The problem is that I don't think it's very balanced. So in solo specifically, when you're testing, the difference in the variance in how strong Claw is when you get Radioactive Man as the first minion, for instance, is so much different than when you get Weapons Runner. If you get Weapons Runner and you test your deck against getting Weapons Runner as your first minion, it doesn't really, it's going to be pretty easy. But if you get Radioactive Man, it's going to be absolutely brutal. And then the Masters of Evil side scheme is actually very difficult. I think this mod set is kind of sneaky OP. Like, it's really difficult when you get Masters of Evil because it has an acceleration icon and it also brings out a Masters of Evil minion. So it's kind of like a double encounter card of two encounter cards that are bad. So in the games that you get the Masters of Evil, it's going to be really difficult. So what you'll notice with Claw is like sometimes he'll just, absolutely destroy you. And then other times he'll put up like no resistance at all. And that lack of consistency makes him a villain that I don't think is actually that good to test your decks against, especially if you're a new player. Because like I feel bad for like the new player that tests their deck against Claw, gets unlucky but they don't realize it, and then thinks their deck is bad. Do not feel bad if you lose to Claw in solo, especially in solo, because he can be very difficult. So instead of using villains as just like one villain to test your deck against, I think it's better to use villains to test specific mechanics that your deck is looking for. If you want to test how survivable your deck is, pair your deck against Juggernaut or something like that to test how good it is at staying alive. If you want to test threat removal, pair your deck against something like Drang, which has a bunch of side schemes, or like Red Skull, which has a bunch of side schemes, so you can test that aspect. I think that's a more reliable way of testing your deck. And speaking of villains, the villain changes a lot. So some villains, you really don't want to just bring up a random deck against them because their mechanic is really hard to deal with. So for instance, Ultron, if you bring a deck that doesn't have a solution for his drones, like you didn't actively think about, I need something to take out the drones, so you grab something like the Hawkeye leadership ally or like the Squirrel Girl leadership ally, you can get overwhelmed really easily. And that's the same for all the villains on this list. There's going to be a lot of villains to where if you don't build around their mechanic and you don't know what they're going to do going in, you can just get completely bamboozled. So make sure you're thinking about that when you're thinking about the villain that you're actually fighting. Are you building a deck that's just generally for all villains? And if you are doing that, these aren't the kind of villains that I would recommend playing against because they test very specific mechanics. But there are some villains that don't do that. So the villains on this page, I think, don't really require any sort of specific deck to work against. So these are villains that if you just build any deck that you think might work, you should feel fine going up against these villains. So yeah, I want to make sure that people like kind of understand that, especially if you're a new player. Some villains do require you to build a deck specifically to beat them, and some don't. And it's going to be very dependent. So like as you play them more, you'll notice that. And then finally, kind of as a last tip here, I want to talk about keywords, because when you're thinking about building a deck, you'll notice like Peter Parker here, he has the Avenger trait on hero side, and he has the Genius trait on alter ego side. And the cards that say play only if you have X trait are generally stronger than other cards. It's like the Quinn Carrier is a wild resource generator in basic. Spider-Man can use that because he has the Avengers trait, and Quinn Carrier is a very good card. Similarly, Moon Girl is one of the best cards in the entire game, but you can only play her if you have the Genius trait. So that's another thing to be aware of as you build your decks, that you should be, if you're going for strength, you want to look at the traits that your hero has, and then think about what cards that you have access to because you have that trait, and consider including those because they'll be very powerful. I think that's all I have here today. I didn't want to just tell you what to do to build the decks. This video is just to give you a framework to get you started on your own deck building journey, which I hope all of you find this useful. And the main advice here is just start building decks. Just build as many decks as you want. And through the process of building your deck, playing that deck, seeing what works, seeing what didn't work, and then making adjustments, playing it again. That's how you're going to, make the most progress on your deck building. And I hope that this video gives you the inspiration to start. So with that, stay zesty, have fun deck building, and I'll see you next time.